Okay, and hello and welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sarah Eifler. I am the Director of Programming at Jewish Veg, and we are a national nonprofit that educates and builds community to encourage plant-based lifestyles through celebrations and conversations about Jewish values. So today we're going to be talking about animal sacrifice, about the history of it, about the why of it, about the transition from it to using prayer as our primary form of worship, and about the kinds of transitions that we can make here and now and today in our own time to experience our Judaism more authentically and more in line with our Jewish values. We are joined today by our President Emeritus at Jewish Veg and the incredible Dr. Richard Schwartz, who's waving hello. And we are going to be hearing from him on his initiative to restore and revitalize the New Year for the Animals, which we'll talk more about that, and also his new book on the subject. So just before I get started, I just want to go through a few quick housekeeping notes. First of all, if you could please remain muted throughout the presentation, that would be really helpful. We will have time for questions towards the end of the hour. And at that time, of course, you can unmute to ask your question. But if you're not currently speaking, please do make sure that you are muted. However, please do feel free to use the chat. We've had some people introducing themselves, letting us know where you're from and why you're here. Please feel free to continue to do that and to use the chat throughout. We do have the live transcript enabled. If you are having any trouble accessing that, or if you have other accessibility needs, please feel free to put that in the chat and we will do our best to help out. And again, as I said, this session is being recorded. So if you would prefer not to show up in the recording, then do please feel free to turn off your camera. We are going to have about 20-ish minutes of a PowerPoint presentation that's going to be followed by about 10 to 15 minutes of conversation with Dr. Richard Schwartz, and the remaining time is going to be used for questions. So I am going to get us started, and unfortunately, I think that I can't minimize while I'm recording. Okay, here we go. Give me a second to deal with tech. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and get us started in talking about sacrifice as an ancient practice and the transition of that practice. The title of this presentation, You Desire Not Sacrifice, comes from Psalm 40. And as you'll see, it's somewhat of a theme throughout what we're going to talk about. So first of all, just to give a little bit of an overview into what is sacrifice in the first place. Sacrifice as it was practiced in ancient Judaism could be offerings of grains, money, or non-human animals. So it was not only a sacrifice of animals, although that was a big part of it. The sacrifices were only performed by a certain group of people, so the Kohanim or the priests. In the Bible, you'll see that God tells Aaron that only he and his descendants are allowed to perform sacrifice. And that continues through the temple period, with only the priests allowed to perform sacrifice and only within the temple. So sacrifice was always limited in Jewish practice. And just to go through a few terms that you might see come up as we talk about this subject, these are not the main or only categories of sacrifice. They are probably the main ones, but they're not the only ones. But just to give a bit of a grounding in when you see these terms come up. So first of all, we have the burnt offering or the olah. The burnt offering is an offering that gets completely consumed on the altar, and it is typically of an animal sacrifice. We also have a sin offering or chatat, a meal offering or mincha, and then a peace offering, shalamim. And the peace offering is more often a grain offering. It's typically not an animal offering. So that's just a basic overview of what sacrifice was and how it was performed with those limitations. But I think more interestingly and more importantly is the question that we would think of now of what is sacrifice actually for? What is the purpose of sacrifice? What exactly does it do and whom does it benefit? So the Bible as a whole talks about sacrifice a lot, and in some places it will simply give instructions on how to perform it. But in other places, the Bible itself will question animal sacrifice in particular. And that we see a lot in the prophets. In the prophets, the book of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, we have the prophets are generally advocates for social reform. And they talk a lot about what does it actually mean to perform sacrifice. And in doing so, they tend to use the voice of God and to talk about God's relationship to sacrifice. So in Isaiah, we see God saying, "What need have I of all your sacrifices? I am sated with burnt offerings of rams and suet of fatlings and blood of bulls, and I have no delight in lambs and he goats." In another prophet, Hosea, we see God saying, "For I desire goodness, not sacrifice, obedience to God rather than burnt offerings." And in Amos, we see God saying, "If you offer me burnt offerings or your meal offerings, I will not accept them. I will pay no heed to your gifts of fatlings." So the prophets, using the voice of God, say that God does not need sacrifice, God does not desire sacrifice, and in fact, God will not even accept sacrifice. So the idea that sacrifice is for God is clearly disproven in the words that the prophets share with us. And that theme continues to the Talmud, which is the collection of rabbis arguing about the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and about Jewish law. And they take a passage from Psalms to talk about this further. So just all of the translations come from Sepharia, and what they do is the bolded text here is a direct translation of the Hebrew. The non-bolded text is kind of their insertion of explanations, because the Talmud can be a little bit difficult to understand. So talking about sacrifice, they say, "Lest you say that God needs these offerings for consumption," the verse states, "If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and everything within it." That's from Psalms 50. It continues, "For every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. I know all the fowls of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine." God as the creator of the world, God as the creator of the non-human animals, and God who has relationship with non-human animals. We see that God has covenant with non-human animals. Non-human animals praise God and worship God. And Judaism has a very strong through line of respect and compassion for the interiority and the agency and the sentience of non-human animals. So why would God want God's own creatures to be sacrificed to God? Here God is saying, that's not what I want. It's stated in the following verse, "Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats?" Is that really how we see our God? This passage goes on to say, "I did not say to you, sacrifice offerings to me so that you will say, I will do God's will and God will do my will. You are not sacrificing to fulfill my will." In other words, very directly, God's saying, sacrifices are not for me. You are sacrificing to fulfill your will. Sacrifices are for the benefit of the human being. So in prophets, in Psalms, in the Talmud, we're seeing throughout Jewish text and tradition that the idea that sacrifice is for the benefit of God is rejected entirely. So then why are we doing it? Or why did they do it? What is the purpose of sacrifice if it's not for God and for relationship with God? So Maimonides, who is a great Jewish sage, offers a historical theory. This is a long quote, so I'm not going to read the full thing. I'm just going to read the bolded text. But Maimonides says, "The custom which was in those days general among all men, people, and the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples to other gods." In other words, in the time and place where people were offering animal sacrifice, which is the area in which the Israelites were, where that was the primary form of worship. In order for Judaism as a religion in quotes, because it's an anachronistic term, But in order for Judaism to succeed and to survive, it would have been impossible for people to transition entirely away from animal sacrifice at that point. Maimonides says, God transferred to God's service that which had formerly served as a worship of other gods. So, and this is from the Guide for the Perplexed. So God and the Israelites are seeing that these other gods are being worshipped through animal sacrifice. People understand animal sacrifice as one of the primary forms of worship in that time and place. And so when Judaism and worship of God is being established originally, people relied on animal sacrifice to legitimize Judaism at the time. That's Maimonides' historical theory. Well, Nachmanides, who's another great Jewish sage who often disagrees with Maimonides, disagrees with him because he's coming at this from a theological perspective. So Maimonides offers this historical idea. Nachmanides says, well, from a theological perspective, if you look at the Bible and you look at Cain and Abel offering sacrifices, you look at Noah offering sacrifices, and you look at the patriarchs offering sacrifices, then the historical theory doesn't make sense, because some of these people existed before anybody else did. So there has to be some other purpose. There has to be a reason that this would have happened, even though it wasn't connected to the historical place. So again, this is another long quote. So Nachmanides says, God instituted that a person who has committed a transgression and offers a sacrifice shall place his hands on it. And then he goes on to detail what happens to the body of the non-human animal, how the animal is slaughtered, how the different parts of the animal are used and burned. All this should make him realize that having sinned against God with his body and soul, he would deserve to have his blood spilled and his body burned. However, God in his infinite mercy accepts this substitute. In other words, when a person sins and they bring a sacrifice to cleanse their sin, what they witness of what happens to the body of the non-human animal, they are meant to understand as what they would deserve to happen to them. And in that understanding, they come to realize that they need to act better and behave better and value their life more. And Nachmanides says that is the purpose of sacrifice. That explanation is the exact explanation that I hear on the streets of Brooklyn when Jewish Veg goes into the streets of Brooklyn during the period of Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur to talk to practitioners of Kippuros. So for those who may not know, Kippuros is a ritual that developed, we think, around 600 CE as a folk ritual. And there were a lot of different ways to perform Kippuros. But there are some Jews who still practice it nowadays, and some of the Jews who still practice it use chickens in order to perform this ritual. And what happens with that time period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, both Kippuros and Kippur come from the same Hebrew root, meaning atonement. Those chickens are trucked in on transport crates, and they are left to sit out on the streets of Brooklyn for that entire time period, shoved into these crates, often sick, often injured, and often not given food or water. So Jewish Veg has partnered with the Alliance to End Chickens as Kippuros since 2018. And we go in, this is my friend Lily offering water to the chickens. You can see the watermelon that the chickens have been given here. And Jewish Veg goes to talk to practitioners and have conversations with them about our shared Jewish values and about using coins instead of chickens for this ritual. But what we've heard, and I have personally heard this several times from practitioners who say that using chickens is the best way to do it, is that exact explanation from Nachmanides, that seeing how the chicken is slaughtered reminds them of how they need to act better in the following year. But the question with that and the problem with that what exactly is that doing for us? If we're relying on violence to teach ourselves to be better, is that really in the best alignment with Jewish values and Jewish belief? And furthermore, especially in the case of Kaporos, we're actually violating Jewish law, which commands us to treat animals with compassion and with respect. So Ar Ba'alei Chaim, meaning to prevent the suffering of animals, is a Torah law. So isn't it more important that we follow those ethics and those values in Judaism and come from a place of real authenticity and ethicality in our worship and in our faith? Well, that's what we decided as a community that we should do. Animal sacrifice and sacrifice of all kinds has been banned since the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. We haven't done it for almost 2,000 years. And that's because we always knew, and Jewish text and tradition always knew, that what really matters is the interiority, the ethicality, the alignment with the Jewish values that we hold so dear, and being the best version of ourselves that we possibly can. In Hosea, at a time when animal sacrifice was still being practiced, we have this passage: "Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to God, forgive all guilt and accept what is good. Instead of bulls, we will pay the offering of our lips." It matters more what we say and what we do. It matters more that we are coming authentically and with love and compassion to God than what the ritual is, and especially in place of the violence that the ritual demands. And so at the destruction of the temple and afterwards, the rabbis decided to institute prayer. This comes again from the Talmud, and it's a very direct quote. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said that the prayers were instituted based on the daily offerings sacrificed in the Holy Temple, and the prayers parallel the offerings in terms of both time and characteristics. So very directly, we have prayer services that correspond to what the sacrificial offerings were. For instance, you may recognize the word mincha as one of the prayer offerings, and you saw it on that list at the beginning, that it was one of the kinds of offerings. And so we already decided as a community that we don't need that kind of violence and that we don't need to be harming other creatures of God in order to bring our best selves forward and to have relationship with God. And not only have we already decided that, not only does this apply to our past, but also to our future. The idea of the world to come, of this messianic era where we come into our best version of our world and ourselves, we actually have rabbinic literature directly about what happens at that time in terms of animal sacrifice, with the idea that at that time we will have a rebuilt third temple. We already have in rabbinic literature from the Midrash this quote saying, Rabbi Pinchas, Rabbi Levi, and Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Menachem from Galia, "In the time to come, all sacrifices will be annulled, but the sacrifice of thanksgiving will not be annulled." So in the time of the temple, we won't need sin offerings. We won't need all of these other offerings that, because we have progressed so much spiritually and as a people, we no longer have any need for. The only sacrifice that we will still have will be the sacrifice of thanksgiving, and that is a grain offering. That is one that does not involve harming animals in any way. So that's a basic overview of what sacrifice was, of rabbinic literature about it, of this discomfort and tension that has always accompanied it, and the decision to move from animal sacrifice and sacrifice in general to prayer as our primary form of worship. That is a major transition that we have taken in Judaism, to move from this one way of worship to another one entirely, and to supersede the ritual of sacrifice with our prayers and with our good deeds. But there are still many more transitions that we can and should be making today in order to bring forth our best selves in alignment with our Jewish values. And so to talk a little bit about that, I want to now welcome the amazing Dr. Richard Schwartz. And I'm going to Go ahead and pin you and myself so that everyone can see us. And go ahead and unmute Richard. And I would just love to ask you, once you're unmuted, if you can tell us a little bit about the New Year for the animals. What was the New Year for the animals?
Okay, first, thanks for wonderful discussion. And this is really a follow-up because New Year for the animals was a time for tithing for these sacrifices you've been talking about. So that actually they had a narrow space that have animals passing through. Every 10th animal would be marked for the sacrifice. So actually, that's why for many years I'd heard about it and said, well, we want to stay away from that. We don't want to really refer to sacrifices. But then I got this idea restoring it, but even more importantly, transforming it into a day devoted to increasing awareness. As you pointed out, we have to treat animals with compassion, respect. So to increase awareness of that, because there's so much, spoke beautifully about this, but there's still so much in the Torah about this, about the Hagim, so much talk about the sacrifices. So we want to get to the more compassionate side and also increase awareness that very unfortunately, the realities for animals are so far from these beautiful Jewish teachings, as you mentioned, of Tsar Chaim.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. So the New Year for the animals, which was this kind of tithing for the animals for sacrifice, which, and we picked this date for a reason. If you want to speak to that, but you're working now on restoring it and revitalizing it. Can you talk a little bit more about those efforts?
Okay, well, it's so super important. So I want to show one thing I've done is this
And Richard,
publication.
if you could just speak up a little bit, be a little
Okay,
louder. Thank you.
okay, thank you. Okay, so one thing I've done is to create this ebook, and by the way, I'll be happy to send a copy of it out to anybody that emails me at veggierich, that's VEGGIERICH @gmail.com, and be happy to send that out to you. And I've had articles recently just published here where I live in Israel in the Jerusalem Post, Jerusalem Report, to try to get the word out on that. And I want to stress something very important. Why is it so super important to restore this new year for animals? And by the way, this is not something completely new because the Kabbalists back in the 16th century, they changed also. This is the new year for animals we're talking about. There was a new year for trees. And that also, the end of the temple, Romans destroyed it, unfortunately, in 70 in the Common Era. After that, no need for sacrifices or also for tithing and decisions about trees. So the main reason for this is, number one, as we've been saying, the realities for animals are so far from Jewish teachings on compassion for animals. Jews are to be Rahmanim b'nei Rahmanim, compassionate children of compassionate ancestors, imitating God whose compassion is over all his works. That's in Psalms 145-9. Proverbs 12:10 says, the righteous individual considers the lives of his or her animals. And many teach as part of the 10 Commandments that not only are humans to rest on the Sabbath day, but non-human animals as well. And the Jew is not to even sit down to his or her own meal before seeing that the animals are fed. But very briefly, the way animals are treated today, just give a couple examples. Dairy cows are artificially impregnated in what the industry itself calls rape racks every year, so they continue giving milk. Their babies are taken away right away. Very cruel process. Great trauma for the mother and for the calf. And egg-laying hens are kept in spaces so small they can't even raise a wing. And therefore, natural instincts are thwarted. They tend to peck at each other. They are debeaked, a very painful process without anesthesia or painkiller. And by the way, the males, even worse, they don't even last maybe a day because they can't lay eggs, of course. They haven't been programmed genetically to be able to have much flesh, so they're killed right away. Okay, now in addition, it's not just that treatment of animals is so far from Jewish conditions. One thing I've been stressing is there's at least 6 mandates that are very seriously violated by animal-based diets. In addition to compassion for animals, these are to take care of our health, treat animals with compassion, as we mentioned, and protect the environment, serve natural resources, help hungry people, and pursue peace. And it's incredible. There could be such a reduction in life-threatening diseases, heart attack, cancer, diabetes, if there was a switch to plant-based diets. Many peer-reviewed articles in respected journals show that. And just a couple of other examples that in a time when an estimated 9 million people are dying of hunger and its effects every year, more than 10% of the world's people are chronically malnourished. Amazingly, 70% of the grain produced in the US, over a third produced worldwide, fed to animals destined for slaughter. And what makes it even more shameful, we take very healthy products, corn and oats and soy, high in fiber, high in complex carbohydrates, devoid of saturated fat and cholesterol. We feed them to animals and we get meat and other animal products with just the opposite unhealthy characteristics. So
So,
many teachings violate, but I want to stress the most important reason nowadays is that the world is heading toward a climate catastrophe. And I speak here from Israel, where it's 97 degrees Fahrenheit, where I am, over 100 in other places, 109 and above in Eilat. And we see such tremendous warnings. The UN Secretary General says it's a code red for humanity. Delay means death. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicated in 2018 that unprecedented changes are needed by 2030 if we are to avoid a climate catastrophe. 4 years later, we find in May of this year announced that the atmospheric carbon dioxide is higher than ever. Now, very important, this is something I've been learning about and trying to stress. There's only one possible way to avert a climate catastrophe, and that is a society-wide shift toward plant-based diets. Now, I say that because the two things that would be very significant. First, methane from cows would be reduced, and methane is 84 times as potent as carbon dioxide. In the 10 to 20 years it's in the atmosphere. So if we get rid of that, that could be very significant. But even more important, this is an amazing thing. There used to be 6 trillion trees in this world. It's now to about 3 trillion. Most of that is because vast areas, over 1/3 of the ice-free areas of this world, are now used for grazing for animals and raising the feed crops we mentioned.
all
And
right. So Richard, you're giving us really detailed information on how urgent this issue is, and how important it is for us to make those shifts in our diets. Can you speak a little bit about why you chose to focus on the New Year for the animals as an opportunity to bring that to more people's attention?
okay, well, I'm trying every possible way, writing articles, writing a book, and just this is something, it's like we need something very dramatic. People are just not, paying enough attention to doing that much. Many people have given up. Now, again, saying that we need a society-wide shift sounds almost utopian. How in the world is it going to happen? Well, there's two very important factors that maybe could make it happen. As I mentioned, the warnings, the fact that the Secretary General of the US called a code red for humanity, hopefully other leaders will point this out, that we are heading to a situation where human beings will be extinct. And just to give an example of that, all the things we see every day, this summers have been unbelievable in terms of the droughts everywhere, the heat waves, the floods, wildfires, and all. And by the way, because of the wildfires, it makes it more likely more will happen, because there's what they call a self-reinforcing positive feedback loop. Because of the fires, we're losing the trees that could sequester the carbon dioxide. All the carbon in the trees is going to the atmosphere. And when you think of all the energy that's going to be needed to rebuild the homes, the factories, the cars that are destroyed, that can make a difference. And the other very, very important factor nowadays is there are so many plant-based substitutes for meat and other animal products. And they say that they have now the appearance, the texture, and taste so close to the animal products that even long-time meat eaters cannot tell the difference. So somehow we have to get this out. I've been blessed, just had a 6th anniversary of living in Israel with 4 grandchildren getting married, 5 great grandchildren, and wondering what kind of world are we leaving for these future generations. So
Right.
this person is very thankful for Jewish Veg for having this program and all the things, Sarah, that you're doing, and Jeff, and everything. So hoping that the idea of a Jewish revitalizing, restoring, and transforming the Jewry for animals will make a very positive difference.
Right. And it's a great opportunity too to talk about how Judaism has such uh, not only a thorough but an extensive and central through line of talking about kindness to animals and respect for animals as one of our primary values. And you mentioned along with that all of our teachings about environment and environmental destruction, all of our teachings about our personal health and community health, and feeding the hungry and taking care of people, and how the food system impacts all of this so incredibly strongly. So, I mean, from your perspective, like as Jews, it's so important for us to be acknowledging these issues and talking about them. And so the New Year for the Animals kind of gave you this way of talking about this really openly within the Jewish community. Is that right?
Well, you put it very beautifully. Absolutely. I mean, thank God we don't have to go to other religions. We don't have to go to secular areas. I mean, Judaism has such powerful, powerful teachings. And, Kuach Nefesh, to save a life, overrides 610 of the 613 commandments. Only the 3 cardinal sins, murder, sexual immorality, and idol worship, are exception to that. And again, Sabari Chaim, very, very strong teachings on that. And Baal Tashkit, by the way, that's another one that's said in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 19 to 20. And that, thankfully, the sages extended the Torah teaching that you cannot destroy fruit-bearing trees, even in wartime, to build a battering ram to overcome an enemy fortification. They extended that, Jewish sages, to general prohibition. But the animal-based diets, in all the addition to the negatives we've been talking about, extremely wasteful of land, energy, water. At a time with all the drought, so many places not enough water, and the fact that it takes up to 13 times as much water on an animal-based diet than a plant-based diet. So it's just amazing. We have truth, morality, justice on our side. And again, I'm so thankful for Jewish Veg as being really the outstanding group in getting this message out. And I'm thankfully being on the board, thankfully President Emeritus, and looking forward to all the continued efforts. And wonderful that we'll have a new website, hopefully early next year, and that can really make a difference.
Thank you so much, Richard. So I'm going to put the link to Richard's book back into the chat. Definitely recommend that everyone check it out. And we're going to go ahead and open up for questions. Like I said, we've left lots of time for questions today because I know this is a topic that we get a lot of questions about. So I'm going to unpin the two of us now. And if you want to go into gallery view to see everyone, you can, or if you want to keep it on speaker view, whatever works for you. And if people are able to use the raise hand function that you find under your reactions, so if you click on that little smiley face that says reactions, and then you click raise hand, then I will know what order to call on people. You are also welcome to use the chat, but I can go ahead now and ask if people have questions, and both Richard and I are available to answer questions. I'm also going to take a look at what's going on in the chat. If you can't find the raise hand function and you would like to just unmute and ask your question, you can also do that. Especially for those of you who are on iPads or iPhones, I know it's a little harder to find that. And I see in the chat, people were talking about what we got influenced by from other cultures. So going back to that Maimonides theory that I think has a lot of historical value and reality to it. Speaking about how we came to perform animal sacrifice because that's what people in the area were doing.
You know, I'm a member of Chabad, and I'm having such arguments with them because they follow the Torah as it says, and if it says animal sacrifices, that's the way it has to be. And I'm just I have proven to them that not only in this area the Israelites were influenced by pagan rituals or by pagan cultures, but in other ones as well. Like Baal and Isha, you know, Baal was a Canaanite god, and Baal means Baalim, it means my husband and my owner. And Baal in Canaanite culture was the owner also. And Ishti comes from Ashtoret. And you know, I find it very difficult, very, very difficult to deal with this, especially with very religious people who cannot see beyond their, you know, beyond their little boxes. It's very difficult.
Yeah, I hear you, Alice. And I know when we speak to people about Kaporos and some people who are, you know, very interested in using coins instead of chickens, or other ways of expressing these values that we all hold in common as Jews, it can be really frustrating to see ways in which people aren't following it the same way that you are, or understanding it the same way that you are. And you know, the only thing we can ever do is meet people where they are and talk to people from a place of compassion and respect, and understanding that we ourselves had a journey to get to where we are. But I hear you and how frustrating it is. And I think you're doing really important work by continuing to have those conversations.
Yeah, and they do believe in the sacrifices. That's it. It's in the Torah, and that's it.
Right. Yeah, it's frustrating, especially when we have so much evidence that the Torah and the Tanakh itself was ambivalent and felt tension around sacrifice, and as we've seen. So thank you for the work you're doing and talking about it. And please feel free to always come to us as people who understand and as our community at Jewish Veg. I see Jill has your hand up, so please go ahead with your question.
Right. Thank you so much. This is a very important conversation, and I really appreciate Richard and Sarah conducting this for us. I know that Kaporos sacrificing animals has gone back, you know, generations, but at one point, Sarah, you mentioned that sacrificing animals has been banned since 70 CE. And then I had another question. Can you speak about that? And then did something revive it again?
Okay, so first of all, Kaporos is not sacrifice. I know this is confusing because it kind of follows the same thoughts that Nachmanides presented on sacrifice. It looks like sacrifice to us, but it is not technically animal sacrifice. So that's important to keep in mind. Like I said, it developed as this folk ritual, and there was opposition to it, including from Nachmanides, because it came too close to sacrifice, and people felt like this is kind of transgressing the ban against sacrifices. But the people who are performing Kaporos today would not consider that to be animal sacrifice. Wow. I'm sorry, was there another part to that question, or did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I actually just had a different question. Sure. You know, with all the work that's being done by your group and by the group trying to stop Kaporos, do we have any statistics or ideas of how much headway we're making in that regard with different, particularly Orthodox and religious communities? Do we know if we've changed minds and practices have changed?
So it's a great question. It is unfortunately extremely difficult, if not impossible, to track numbers. However, what I can tell you, and I see, I'm going to go through the questions in the chat, so I do see them, but I do see the question here about we're beyond being nice. Could we step it up? And I so hear the frustration. It is very, very difficult to be seeing something happen that transgresses your values, transgresses Jewish values, and feel like the only thing you can do is have conversations about it. And I promise you, the conversations are the most effective way that we can make headway on this issue, because we have tried other things and they have not worked. Until Jewish Veg got involved with the Alliance to End Chickens as Kaporos, they were running it as a protest. And it got very hostile and very tense. And Jews are stubborn people. And if you tell anyone, let alone a group of stubborn Jews, and yell at them not to do something, they're just going to do it a lot more. And that's what happened. And when we started having calm, respectful conversations with practitioners, we did start seeing change. Every year we go in, there are more sites that are not operating. Fewer and fewer people are doing it. We always have conversations with people every year who say, either you're right and I'm already going to use coins, or you're right and I'm going to actually use coins this year or next year, depending on if they've already performed the ritual that year. We have people who surrender chickens for rescue, who say, please, not to us, Jewish Veg is not involved in the rescue, but when chicken rescue happens, a lot of the time it's because practitioners have said, please save this chicken. So we do see shifts. It's not overnight. It is long-term, it is hard work, but it is definitely something that is in process. I also, before I move on to questions I see in the chat, and I see a fair amount of them, I want to put this link in. If you are in Brooklyn or New York, or if you're able to get to Brooklyn or New York during the time period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and you want to join us in the work we are doing for Kaporos, please fill out the form in the chat, because we would love to have you and we could really use some volunteers. Okay, I am going to go to I think I saw a question at one point. Did animal sacrifice happen during the period between the first and second temple? Richard, do you want to take that one?
Well, actually, I think, as you pointed out, Sarah, these sacrifices could only be done in the temple. As a matter of fact, one of the thoughts was that this was the common mode of worship, as you talked about Maimonides. That was what he said. And the feeling was that having it in one place would hopefully to wean the Jews away from that. So without the temple, there would be no animal sacrifice. And this ties in with one of Joe's questions in terms of what could possibly make the sacrifices come back. And I think that would only be in a third temple. But as Sarah pointed out, many feel that at that time, if it's a messianic period, a third temple, people will be at a higher level, a higher madrega. There won't be a need for sin offerings, guilt offerings, and all. And they will, but Thanksgiving is always, of course, appropriate. And that, as Sarah pointed out, that could be with grains and all. So I think between the temples, I never really studied it all, but without a temple, assume there were no animal sacrifices at that time, just as since 70 CE, there hasn't been. And thankfully, it's a wonderful thing about Judaism that terrible tragedy, the temple was destroyed, but the rabbis came up and said, now we have prayer, we have Gemilut Hasadim, good deeds, and other positive things. So Judaism continued way beyond that point.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, absolutely. All right, I see a question. Has there been any work educating the religious communities about alternatives to chicken or meat for festive meals like Shabbat and holidays? Seems like that practice comes from the fact that meat was expensive and holidays was where they had special meals. Yes, that is true. And, that meat was kind of seen as this something to give delight. But of course, if you're not taking delight in meat, then you're not supposed to be eating it for Shabbat and holidays. And it's hard to take delight in something that you know is contributing to all of these transgressions of Jewish values, like we've talked about, that's causing harm to animals, that's causing harm to the environment, causing harm to ourselves and to public health. And so that is the exact work that Jewish Veg does. We exist as an organization in order to teach the Jewish community about why this issue is so important, and to celebrate with the Jewish community in full accordance with Jewish values, meaning that we offer celebrations of holidays, of Jewish holidays that are totally vegan. So you may have heard of our Seder that we hold every year, where we have a fully vegan, not only a fully vegan Seder, but a fully vegan Haggadah, and we teach about these issues. So thank you for that question, Tammy. That's exactly what we try to do. Okay, I addressed the question of being nice. Okay, I see a question, a statement about a doctor who advised someone not to eat fake meats. So this is, I don't want to get into any specific nutritional issues because I'm not a doctor or a nutritionist. However, I will say most doctors are not taught about nutrition. They may have had like one class in medical school however many years ago, and that's a maybe. They may not have even had that class. So just, use your common sense, use your your own intelligence, use your own research, look into these issues from the nutritional perspective. But I can promise you, there's been study after study after study that eating meat can be harmful to a human body in a lot of ways. Fake meats are generally, as highly processed foods, not the most nutritious, and they still generally do better than meat that comes from animal products. Again, these are all generalities, so I encourage everyone to, do your research, decide what works for you, but keep in mind, most doctors don't really know all of this new research and all of these facts. Okay, I'm still looking through the chat. Okay, I see. Was it possibly more humane for the animals when the animal sacrifices were actually taking place? Because then people were eating meat for a reason, the reminder of each individual part of the animal being sacrificed and how they connect with our emotional experience on this planet, other than killing animals somewhat mindlessly and eating them strictly to satisfy our appetite. Okay, great question, Michael. So, first of all, yes, it was probably more humane because factory farms did not exist at that point. However, we got to think a little bit about the idea of humane and the idea of killing as humane. So that in and of itself is, I believe, kind of a contradiction in terms. If an animal, just like we do, wants to live and wants to live out their life, in taking the life of that animal, we are taking something. However, yes, it is very different to consider the kind of practices that existed pre-factory farms and what happens now on factory farms, which are egregiously horrible. I do want to give Richard a chance to chime in on this question. So what do you think about having that difference between what used to happen and how we operate now?
Right. Actually, I have an article about this, and then it was really a sacrifice. Now it's mass, as Sarah's been saying, factory farming, mass production, and all that. And it's supposed to be the shochet saying a special blessing for each animal, and that's the way it used to be years ago. Now it's like mass production, so many animals so fast and all that. And person, was sort of more committed, would lay his hands on the animals before the sacrifice took place. Something, the individual was really involved in that. Again, so today it's super mass produced, billions and billions of animals, and with all the negative effects, again, and that we've been saying on the health, on and certainly on the environment as well. But thankfully, we don't have the sacrifices today. And again, according to Rav Kook and others, even in the third temple, the Messianic period that Jews yearn for, that will not be with animal sacrifices again. Nice cat.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, sorry. She likes to join me even when she should not be here. Thank you, Richard. Okay, Yael, I see your hand.
I'm wondering if
Oh, sorry, Yael, it's hard to hear you. Could you speak a little closer to your mic?
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm wondering if the whole concept of sacrificing of animals, of slaughtering animals, is misunderstood. And it doesn't feel to me that there's a balance between God who gives life, that God would want us to violently and barbarically take life for God's sake. So I think the whole premise, the whole foundation of sacrifice might be a misunderstanding.
Yeah, I believe that too. The word, I don't remember if I mentioned this or not, but the word for sacrifice, korban, comes from the root meaning to draw close or to draw near. And so there's this whole discussion, throughout the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, of blood as the life and God as the giver of life. So I think there is a mistake. I think the mistake of thinking that you can draw close, that root korban, draw close to God through blood, through the spilling of blood. And it is a complete misunderstanding of what it actually means to value life and the potency and the importance of the symbol of blood as life. And people just didn't really understand it. That's what I believe too, absolutely. And I think, like, as we saw, it's very clear throughout Jewish text and tradition that sacrifice was not for God. And God repeatedly says, I don't want this, I don't need this, I won't even accept this. And it was always for the benefit of people. Yeah. You are muted if you had a response to that.
No, I'm just nodding, saying thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank everybody for coming today. We have time for maybe one more question. If anyone has one more question. Alice, I see you unmuted. Alice, did you have a question?
No, not me.
Okay.
So I just want to mention again, if anybody contacts me at veggierich@gmail.com, I'll be happy to send ebook to you. And also, as I mentioned, PDFs of this book here, which has been, thank God, got a very favorable review. That's Vegan Revolution, Saving Our World, Revitalizing Judaism. And I'm happy to say that now here in Israel, thank God, there's really been a movement toward veganism. So many restaurants here, some considered the vegan capital, especially in Tel Aviv. And we are pioneers also in developing plant-based substitutes. As sort of mentioned before, it's not the healthiest alternative, but it's just maybe as a transition food. But then there's so much, by the way, very important to note that Adam and Eve were vegan. So beginning in Gan Eden, people were vegans, as well as in the Messianic period. And that's based, by the way, on Isaiah, who said that in this ideal time, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the lion will eat straw the ox, no one shall hurt nor destroy in all of God's holy mountain. And based on that, Rav Kook and others felt that the Messianic period that we yearn for will also be vegan.
Thank you so much, Richard. Yes, absolutely. So we are going to end the program here. I would ask if everyone could please just take a moment. It should only take like 2 minutes and fill out the survey that you'll find in the chat. That would help us so much. We really, really rely on your feedback for events like this. I want to thank you all so much for spending this hour with us, bringing your questions and your thoughts and the amazing conversation in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Richard Schwartz, for spending your time with us and sharing with us. And so I'm going to stop the recording. If people still have questions and want to stay on a little bit, I will hang on. Otherwise, please feel free to continue your day. And Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov, thank you for joining us.
Right. By the way, if I can just put